Амбасадоре, ова лето изјавивте дека Европската Унија ќе го загуби својот кредибилитет доколку Македонија не добие датум за отпочнување на преговори. Како ја оценувате сегашната ситуација?
Well, there's no doubt that the delays that have occurred this year and the refusal to allow the opening of accession negotiations with both North Macedonia and Albania have undermined and weakened the credibility of the European Union and its leverage in the whole accession process. And it's very unfortunate because the enlargement policy of the European Union was always seen as a success story in the past decades. So we have to hope that this is just a temporary setback and that now with the new Commission which has just taken up office, the new President of the Council, that there will be a renewed push and much stronger lobbying to reverse the decision that happened, the non-decision of this year, and that next year will have better news. But I can understand the great feeling of frustration of the people here at what happened this year after all the work that had been done by the government, by the country, and all the citizens putting their hope in the European Union. So this hope has to be responded to by the European Union in the future.
Реформа или крај на проширувањето? Како го дефинирате францускиот non-paper?
Well, I have looked at this document from the French government and I can find nothing in there that justifies a delay in the enlargement process. We all agree that the method of negotiation is very complicated, complex, bureaucratic, and that it needs to be reformed. But there's no reason why these reforms and the changes in methodology that are being proposed by the French, which there's very little new in all of that, there's no reason why this cannot be done in parallel with the negotiations. And I'm very pleased to see that the new President of the Commission has made very clear that in her view the changes in methodology can be introduced in parallel with the process of negotiation.
Ако француските локални избори се важни за председателот Макрон, кои треба да бидат нашите очекувања од следниот Европски совет на 26 и 27 март?
Well, you are right in intimating that one of the main reasons or motivation behind the French approach is the domestic situation in France, the fact that support for enlargement is relatively low and the populist parties very often equate enlargement of the European Union with increased immigration and they add very populist messages which are not substantiated in reality. But the trouble is the timing. The local elections, the second round is the second half of March, which is just a few days before the European Council. In my view, it's too soon. And I believe that probably the next chance of a decision by the European Council will be in June, after the summit of the European Union with the Western Balkan countries, which is scheduled for the 6th of May in Zagreb. But there's a lot of work to be done in the meantime by the European Commission. They should, and I think they are preparing a document which will incorporate all of the various elements in the French paper that can be presented to the European Council, to the Member States, to the European Parliament in January, February, so that there's enough time for discussion and that then this will enable a decision to be taken in June. And of course, in the meantime, the government here must redouble its efforts with regard to the reforms.
Што да очекуваме од новиот состав на Европската комисија и особено од новиот еврокомесар за проширување Оливер Вархеј?
Well, we have to see. His responsibility is critically important. He has to demonstrate by his actions that, and I think he has already stated, that he is fully supportive of the enlargement process. What is important, I think, is the President of the Commission. Her message is very clear, that the negotiations for accession must be opened with North Macedonia and with Albania. We do know, of course, that there are a number of member states, more than in the case of North Macedonia, that believe that the political situation in Albania don't warrant the opening of negotiations now. But even if there's a delay of a few months, it shouldn't matter. The important thing is that for North Macedonia, there should be a decision to open accession negotiations as quickly as possible. And the other positive element is the new High Representative, Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Borrell, who already in his first letter to the foreign ministers of the European Union has made very clear that his priority is to ensure that the Western Balkan region is deeply anchored in the European Union. And I think that in itself is a very positive element and should give hope to the government here and to the people of North Macedonia that there will be some positive developments soon.
Македонија допрва ја чека пржинска влада и предвремени парламентарни избори во април.
Yes.
Колку е ова неопходно во овој момент?
Well, obviously it would have been ideal if there wasn't a necessity for early elections, because we all know how the past history of the country has shown that elections are always problematic. And I witnessed a number of difficult electoral periods here, even if the technical arrangements are reflecting the European standards, but the whole process is very often undermined by very bitter partisan politics. So this time, if the elections are confirmed, which is likely for the 12th of April, there will be much greater scrutiny by the European Union, because there will be some who will want to see if mistakes are made and so on. So it will be the responsibility of the state institutions, the government, to make sure that the best possible conditions are in place for the conduct of these elections, and that partisan politics must be left aside, and that there should be, the whole focus must be on the broad interests of the country as a whole and achieving the foreign policy goals. And at the same time, the government must demonstrate its determination to continue with the reforms. You know that one of the criticisms that have been leveled against the government and against this country relate to the abuse of power and corruption. And there have been many cases of abuse of power and corruption that have been identified, and yet convictions have been so low. And this is not understandable for many of us. How is it possible that so many cases identified and the judicial process has still barely started? So the government will really, and the judiciary will really have to demonstrate that it has the capacity to deal with this, and that the legal system works for everybody, whether they're senior politicians or others. It should be applied equally to all. There's no one above the law. And I think this is where the government will need to show its determination to deal with this, and that there can be no tolerance for even the smallest level of corruption in the future. The other element that I would stress in this period is that unfortunately this country has suffered so much from partisan politics, and this is a cancer in the society. It undermines the whole process of development, it undermines the democratic institutions, and there really needs to be a realization by the political leaders that these partisan politics are really destroying the country's future, And that's why many people are leaving, emigrating, because they don't see a future for them in that country. So there really has to be a much greater effort by the political leaders to search for political consensus that will bring all the parties together on some of those key reforms that are still outstanding, the law on public prosecution, for example, and many other areas, to demonstrate to the European Union, and more particularly to the citizens of the country, that the leaders, political leaders, are working for the country and not for their own party interests.
Како го оценувате процесот рекета?
Well, this of course was a tragic development, which unprecedented, that the special prosecutor herself would be seen to be involved in activities, and all these allegations need to be now brought to justice, and there has to be a very clear determination to process all of these cases as quickly as possible. I must emphasize that the approach of the government at the very beginning has been a very positive one, an inclusive governance involving dialogue with civil society, with all actors in society. But this new model of governance and this new approach must be a permanent feature of governing in the country, not just in the first year, second year of office. So there have been some weaknesses in a number of areas, lack of consistency. This has to be rectified in order to give confidence to the citizens that the government and all the state institutions are working for the interests of the citizens, and thus to ensure better confidence of the citizens that the judicial process is working properly and that corruption will be rooted out.
Колку е опасна праксата на продолжување на бомбите?
Well, all of these cases and the conversations that were the eavesdropping, all of that, this all must be clarified, must come out. All of the cases must come out. It's not normal that some cases are brought out but others are not dealt with, and there has to be a clear across the board dealing with these cases, and the quicker it's done the better, because otherwise it's quite understandable that people lose faith in the judicial process and in the proper functioning of the judiciary. So there has to be, all of this must come out in the open as quickly as possible.
Дел од аналитичарите сметаат дека земјата има реформи, но само на лист хартија. Каде според вас заглавува системот?
Well, this has been a common feature, unfortunately, of the situation in the country for the past decade, where laws are adopted, we've ticked that box, we've done that, but not enough resources, financial resources, human resources to ensure proper implementation, and not enough monitoring of the legislation to make sure that it is being properly implemented. And the fault lies, of course, with the state institutions, first and foremost, but also I have to say that the fault lies with the European Union in its own assessments. There needs to be a much more rigorous assessment of the situation, and the EU should also strengthen its monitoring mechanisms so that if a country is seen to be going off track or not respecting the deadlines of a particular legislation, then there should be sanctions should be imposed, so that or aid withdrawn, so that there really are incentives there to preempt any attempt by a government, a sitting government, to delay the process because of party political reasons, which go against the interests of the country. So this needs to, and in that respect, the proposals that were emphasized by the French government need to be taken on board by the European Commission.
So Fluore, thank you